The courthouse records in Madison County, Kentucky, tell of 4 separate deaths between 1837 and 1841. A respected attorney who fell from his horse on a foggy morning, a banker found drowned in the shallow waters of Otter Creek, a circuit judge who succumbed to sudden illness during harvest season, and finally, a county sheriff discovered at the bottom of his own well. What these records do not reveal is that all 4 men were married to sisters from the same American family, and that each death occurred within 18 months of their respective weddings. The Holloway sisters, Abigail, Ruth, Caroline, and Lydia, had inherited the largest farm in Madison County, and they would kill to keep it whole. Before we continue with the tale of the Holloway family farm and the 4 widows who refused to be separated, let me take you back to the summer of 1836, when everything changed for the Holloway sisters, and a single candlelit conversation sealed the fate of 4 prominent men. The Holloway farm stretched across more than 900 acres of Kentucky's most fertile soil, bordered by Otter Creek to the north and the Lexington Pike to the south. Their father, Daniel Holloway, had carved his fortune out of nothing but grit and stubbornness. He had come down from Virginia with only a mule and a few tools, but through 30 years of backbreaking labor and shrewd trades, he built an estate that rivaled anything between Lexington and Louisville. By 1836, his property was worth more than most small towns. A grand brick house, barns large enough to shelter hundreds of livestock, tobacco-curing sheds, and grain silos that fed neighbors during lean winters. But Daniel Holloway died that October, leaving behind a problem that could have destroyed any ordinary family. Kentucky inheritance statutes dictated that a man's property be divided equally among his children upon death. Daniel had no sons. His 4 daughters, Abigail, 28, Ruth, 26, Caroline, 24, and Lydia, 21, now faced the prospect of watching their father's life's work carved into useless fragments, sold off to satisfy creditors and tax collectors. The Holloway girls had grown up knowing this day would come. Their father drilled into them the importance of land, telling stories of his own father losing property in Virginia to creditors and how families were scattered once their soil was gone. "Land is more than dirt," Daniel would say, his weather-beaten hands gripping the plow handles. "Land is your blood, your name, your very soul. Lose the land and you lose yourself." Madison County farmers understood such words. Ownership of soil was sacred, the true measure of a family's survival. But clinging to land and actually managing to keep it were 2 very different challenges. The Holloway sisters were not ordinary farm women. Abigail, the eldest, possessed a sharp intelligence, sharpened further by her ability to conceal it behind soft smiles and lowered eyes. She had been secretly keeping the farm's ledgers since their father's eyesight began failing, and she could calculate interest faster than any bank clerk. Ruth had inherited their father's uncanny gift for reading people, sensing their weaknesses and desires with unnerving precision. Caroline, with her porcelain features and graceful manner, was so beautiful she seemed untouchable, and yet beneath her angelic appearance lay a practical streak as cold as steel. Lydia, the youngest, had been blessed with a charm that could win anyone's trust, her voice sweet enough to soften suspicion, and her innocence a mask for deception. Together they formed a conspiracy of survival that would stain the history of Madison County forever. It began in the nights following Daniel Holloway's funeral. They gathered in the brick farmhouse kitchen, shutters drawn, lamplight flickering across their pale faces. The burden of property taxes and debts hung heavy. Marriage, the usual solution for women in their position, meant separation. Different names, different households, different loyalties. Unless, they realized, marriage could be twisted to serve their purposes instead of destroying them. "We stay together," Abigail declared one November night when frost veiled the windows and the fire snapped against the hearth. "Whatever it takes, we stay together and we keep the farm whole." "The law says otherwise," Caroline replied quietly. "Ever practical." "The law," Ruth said slowly, her dark eyes fixed on the table, "can be shaped." But it was Lydia, soft-voiced and unassuming, who spoke the words that damned them all. "Men die, sisters. Husbands die. And widows inherit everything." The first death came only months later, March 15, 1838, just 14 months after Daniel Holloway's funeral, and 6 months after Abigail's marriage to Thomas Grayson, the most prominent attorney in Madison County. Grayson was a logical choice. A widower in his early 40s, childless, wealthy, and influential enough to secure the Holloway estate through legal restructuring. Their courtship was swift but convincing. Grayson, lonely and ambitious, was charmed by Abigail's sharp wit and apparent devotion. Within 2 months of their meeting at Sunday service, he was convinced he had found a partner for both heart and ambition. The wedding in December 1837 was a grand affair. Grayson moved into the Holloway farmhouse, bringing his wealth and his legal expertise. He created a trust to protect the land, ensuring all 4 sisters had security. On the surface, Abigail appeared a dutiful wife. But Thomas Grayson soon learned that his bride's loyalty lay not with him but with her sisters. She insisted they continue living under the same roof. Dismissing his pleas for privacy, she used his legal contacts to probe the financial standings of other county bachelors, a fact that unsettled him. By March, tension had grown sharp. On the foggy morning of March 15th, Thomas Grayson mounted his horse to ride into Richmond. He and Abigail had quarreled over an offer that might take them to Lexington. She had refused, her cold reply echoing in his ears. "We do not leave. We do not separate, ever." By mid-morning, his riderless horse staggered back to the farm, eyes wild, foam at its mouth. Hours later, they found his body near the road, neck broken, chest crushed as though the horse had stumbled and trampled him. The coroner, Dr. John McCreary, ruled it an accident, a tragic fall. Yet neighbors whispered that Grayson was too skilled a horseman to have been unseated so easily. The mare had been unusually spooked, as if driven to panic. But suspicion dulled beneath the grief of the young widow. Abigail performed her role flawlessly, weeping at the funeral, accepting condolences, and securing her husband's assets with brisk efficiency. Within a month, Ruth Holloway was seen in the company of Madison County's wealthiest banker, Jonathan Pierce. And so the cycle began again. Jonathan Pierce was the kind of man whose wealth shaped the destiny of entire towns. In his late 30s, the banker had inherited his father's institution in Richmond and expanded it until half the farms in Madison County owed him money. His fortune rivaled those of Lexington's merchant families, and his authority was unquestioned. 3 years widowed after losing his wife to fever, he had withdrawn into ledgers and loan documents, burying himself in figures and obligations. But Ruth Holloway knew how to unlock a man like Pierce. She began appearing at the bank under the pretense of business, her veil low, her voice soft. She asked questions about family accounts and inheritance settlements, and little by little their conversations strayed from finance to the loneliness of widowhood and the fear of being left unprotected. "I worry about my sisters," she told him one afternoon, her words trembling with carefully measured sincerity. Abigail mourned still. "Caroline and Lydia, they are so young, so vulnerable. A woman alone in this world has no shield without family." Pierce, who had never known the comfort of siblings, was drawn to her devotion. Here was a woman who seemed to place blood ties above self-interest, whose loyalty was so absolute it humbled him. Within 6 months, the banker was captivated, and in October of 1838, Ruth Holloway became Mrs. Jonathan Pierce. Like his predecessor, Pierce moved into the Holloway farmhouse. He restructured the estate again, strengthening the family's financial security, never questioning why Ruth insisted her sisters must always remain together under one roof. But Jonathan Pierce was not blind. He was a man trained to notice patterns, and by November he had begun to keep a private journal. His entries, later uncovered in a locked desk at the bank, revealed suspicions that gnawed at him. November 3, 1838. Ruth insists on keeping separate accounts for each sister, claiming it's temporary. Yet Caroline has no suitors despite beauty. Lydia discourages men outright. I begin to wonder if marriage is even their intention. November 18th. Abigail asked detailed questions about inheritance law, widows' rights, and intestate property. She claimed curiosity, but her knowledge exceeds what most men in my profession understand. It felt calculated. December 1st, overheard Ruth and Abigail whispering about keeping unity and protecting legacy. When they saw me, they turned to Christmas preparations. I feel watched, not loved. By early 1839, Pierce was convinced the sisters had formed some secret pact. His suspicions deepened when he noticed Judge Samuel Whitaker, the most powerful circuit judge in central Kentucky, calling frequently at the farmhouse. Whitaker, a distinguished widower in his 50s with grown children living in Louisville, had long been rumored to seek remarriage. His presence, coupled with Ruth's evasions, sharpened Pierce's fear. Yet he underestimated the danger, believing awareness would protect him. The second death came on February 8, 1839, during one of the harshest winters Kentucky had seen in decades. The Otter Creek, which bordered the Holloway land, had frozen solid for the first time in memory. Pierce, who liked to patrol his property boundaries, set out in the morning fog. Hours later, his body was discovered downstream, wedged against a fallen sycamore. He had plunged through the ice and drowned in the freezing current. The coroner ruled it a tragic accident, common enough in winter. Yet Pierce's journal told another story. His final entry, dated the day before, read, "Ruth knows I suspect something. She watches me constantly, claims she fears for my safety. Yet her concern feels like surveillance. Tomorrow I mean to confront her. If something happens, look to the Holloway sisters. They are not what they seem." Once again, grief cloaked the farmhouse. Ruth wept, Abigail comforted, Caroline prayed, and Lydia sang soft hymns at the graveside. But neighbors whispered that their tears were strangely practical, their eyes more calculating than shattered. Still, in a community where widowhood commanded sympathy and suspicion of women seemed unthinkable, no one dared voice the darker thought aloud. 6 weeks later, Caroline Holloway announced her engagement to Judge Samuel Whitaker. If Ruth's marriage had raised eyebrows, Caroline's shocked the county. Whitaker was the very definition of respectability. His judgments shaping the law of the region, his name spoken with reverence from Lexington to Frankfort. That he would wed a Holloway girl so soon after Pierce's drowning struck many as uncanny coincidence. But the judge appeared smitten, claiming Caroline had brought light and warmth back into his home after years of loneliness. The wedding in July 1839 was modest compared to her sister's. The whispers around the Holloway name too loud to invite spectacle. Whitaker divided his time between his home in Richmond and the farmhouse, preferring to spend court days in town. His notes, later found in a locked trunk, revealed a man increasingly alarmed by the family he had married into. August 10th. Caroline insists on knowing my every movement, claims it is for planning meals, but her questions focus on when I travel alone. It feels less like affection than strategy. August 25th. Overheard Abigail and Ruth discussing the final arrangement. Caroline seemed frightened when she noticed me, but her fear felt rehearsed. September 2nd. Caught Caroline reading my will. Her explanation was feigned confusion, but her questions were far too precise for innocence. Whitaker's suspicions hardened as he examined old coroner's reports. He found that both Grayson and Pierce had quarreled with their wives about leaving Madison County before their sudden deaths. He discovered that both had amended their wills shortly before dying, heavily favoring their widows and thus the Holloway estate. The pattern was undeniable. By October, Whitaker was no longer the only man suspicious. A private investigator named Daniel Murphy began asking questions around Richmond, claiming to represent concerned parties disturbed by the Holloway sisters' rising fortune. Murphy requested coroner's reports, examined property records, and spoke to neighbors in hushed tones. Whitaker, upon hearing of Murphy's inquiries, attempted to contact him, only to learn the investigator had left town abruptly. Still, whispers spread. Someone beyond Madison County was beginning to piece together the truth. On October 30th, Whitaker confronted his young wife in the farmhouse parlor. Rain pounded the windows, the fire hissed in the hearth, and for the first time in weeks, Abigail and Ruth were away in town. Alone with Caroline, he delivered his judgment as though from the bench. "I know what your sisters have done. The question is whether you are their accomplice or their next victim." Caroline's reaction was a collapse into tears, her face pale, her hands trembling. She whispered that she had prayed someone would stop her sisters before they forced her into crimes she could not bear. Then she confessed everything. Abigail had been the mastermind, conceiving the plan after their father's death. Ruth had executed Pierce's drowning, studying the ice for weeks, then guiding him to the weakest spot and holding him under the freezing water. Abigail had drugged Thomas Grayson before spooking his horse. Lydia, sweet Lydia, was practicing poisons for Whitaker himself, experimenting on stray animals with foxglove extract. His death was planned for November 15th, a slow poisoning to mimic heart failure. Whitaker's horror deepened when Caroline revealed that Murphy, the investigator, was not hunting the sisters. He was on their payroll, feeding them information about who in the county suspected their schemes. Their net of control stretched further than Whitaker had imagined. Yet Caroline, perhaps desperate, perhaps cunning, pressed a leather-bound journal into his hands. In it she had recorded their crimes, the planning, the conversations, the evidence. Whether it was proof of her redemption or another layer of manipulation, Whitaker could not know. But as he turned the pages, the sound of horses in the yard and voices at the door announced the return of Abigail and Lydia. "They must not know I told you," Caroline whispered. "If they suspect, they will kill you tonight." Whitaker, seasoned by decades of trials, understood then that he was standing in the middle of the most dangerous case of his life, one where the jury, the judge and the executioners all wore the same familiar faces. The journal Caroline had given him was damning. Page after page described their scheme in meticulous detail. How Abigail had studied Thomas Grayson's habits. How Ruth had chosen the treacherous patch of Otter Creek. How Lydia had been experimenting with foxglove to mimic heart failure in Judge Whitaker himself. The ink trembled with Caroline's growing dread, yet each line confirmed what he already suspected. The Holloway sisters had turned marriage into a weapon, and widowhood into a business. As Whitaker read, the crunch of wagon wheels and the clatter of hooves announced Abigail and Lydia's return. Caroline hurriedly concealed the journal beneath her shawl, whispering, "If they learn what I've told you, neither of us will live until morning." The front door creaked open, and laughter floated into the house, light as music yet weighted with menace. Lydia's voice, sweet and childlike, carried through the hallway. "Sister, you should have heard the gossip in town. Mrs. Wilkins says the Holloway women must have some spell over men. So much fortune, so much tragedy, all in one family." Her laughter chimed again, and it chilled Whitaker more than the storm outside. The sisters swept into the parlor, their faces masks of concern. "Cornelius," Abigail said smoothly, her tone as measured as a lawyer's plea. "We've heard whispers that outsiders are asking questions. Federal men even. They mean to dig into our affairs, into your affairs. We must decide on a story before anyone comes knocking." Whitaker felt his stomach knot. Even now, Abigail was seeking to control the narrative, to bend truth into something pliable. He opened his mouth to protest, but before a word left his lips, the thundering of hooves outside drew every eye to the window. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness. A dozen riders approached, their formation disciplined, their purpose unmistakable. "Federal marshals," Caroline breathed, her voice cracking. The Holloway sisters exchanged sharp glances. Chairs scraped, drawers slammed, hurried whispers rattled through the kitchen. They were preparing as though this scenario had been rehearsed many times. Abigail reappeared, calm as ever, though her eyes burned with cold fire. "Cornelius, Margaret." She still called Caroline by her middle name when speaking with formality. "We must stand united. Say only what I tell you. Anything else will bring ruin upon us all." Whitaker rose, his voice hard. "I will tell them everything. Your crimes end tonight." For the first time, Abigail's mask cracked. Fury flashed across her face. "Fool," she hissed. "Do you think the law will save you? We have protection in higher places than you can dream. Men of power profit from our work. Do you believe 4 women could carry out such deeds without allies?" Before Whitaker could respond, the pounding of fists shook the door. "Federal marshals, open in the name of the United States." 6 armed men stormed into the farmhouse, torches flickering, rifles leveled. At their head stood Marshal William Davies, a grizzled veteran of 20 campaigns. His eyes swept the room like a hawk. "Judge Samuel Whitaker," he declared, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and murder." The words struck like a thunderclap. Abigail's lips curved into a smile sharp as a blade. They had turned the tables. Somehow the Holloways had framed him, twisting his investigation into proof against himself. Caroline rushed forward, clutching the journal, her tears streaming. "No, you don't understand. My husband is innocent. It's my sisters, Abigail, Ruth, and Lydia. They murdered their husbands. I have proof." Abigail countered with her own performance, her tone honeyed with pity. "My poor sister has lost her mind. She imagines fantasies, conspiracies. Dr. McCreary can attest her nerves have been fragile for months. But Marshal Davies was not so easily deceived." He raised a hand, silencing both women. "We've received testimony from Daniel Murphy, the investigator you hired," he said, his gaze fixed on Abigail. "He brought us financial records, poison vials, forged wills, evidence enough to hang a dozen men. He told us everything. For a heartbeat, silence hung like a noose. Then Lydia's sweet mask shattered. Her voice rose in a shriek. Murphy was supposed to burn it. He promised if we paid him, the evidence would vanish. The confessions sealed their fate. Abigail turned on her youngest sister with eyes full of murder, but it was too late. The marshals moved swiftly, shackling the Holloway women as they cursed and struggled. Caroline thrust the journal into Whitaker's hands. "Read it," she begged Davies. "Every word is true. I wrote it all. Let justice finally come." The trial that followed in Lexington became the sensation of the age. Newspapers from New Orleans to New York carried lurid headlines. The Holloway widows, Kentucky's murderous sisters. Witnesses recounted strange conversations, suspicious accidents, the calculated charm that lured powerful men to ruin. The journals, Pierce's entries and Caroline's confessions, painted a picture so damning that even the most sympathetic jurors recoiled. Abigail, Ruth and Lydia Holloway were convicted on multiple counts of murder and conspiracy. On March 15, 1841, 3 years to the day after Thomas Grayson's death, they were hanged together before a crowd of thousands. The three sisters walked calmly to the scaffold, their faces composed, their eyes unrepentant. Abigail's final words rang over the hushed assembly. "We saved those men from misery. We gave them love until the very end. We were merciful." The trapdoor fell and the Holloway conspiracy ended on the gallows. Caroline was spared execution. In exchange for her testimony, she received immunity. She and Judge Whitaker vanished westward, settling under new names in Ohio. The Holloway farm was seized, the grand brick house torn down, the soil parceled to repay victims' families. But rumors lingered. Documents uncovered years later suggested the Holloway plan had already spread beyond Kentucky. Similar deaths, eerily timed, appeared in Virginia, Tennessee, and Missouri. Wealthy men leaving behind strangely well-prepared widows. Some whispered the Holloway sisters had sown seeds of a wider network, a shadowy league of women who turned matrimony into murder. The Holloway case left its scar on the law. Probate courts grew wary of sudden inheritances. Investigators studied patterns of widowhood with suspicion, and society learned reluctantly that evil could wear the face of angelic women, that domestic virtue could hide ambition blacker than night. Today, where the Holloway farm once stood, there is nothing but shops and parking lots, the soil paved over, its history forgotten by most. Yet when the wind rises over Otter Creek, some say you can still hear the echoes of a woman's voice, calm and commanding, whispering, "We stay together. Whatever it takes, we stay together." The Holloway sisters remain a cautionary tale, a reminder that beneath the gentlest smiles can lurk the darkest schemes, and that family loyalty, twisted by greed and fear, can become more dangerous than any enemy outside the home. Their story warns us that true terror often lives not in strangers but in those closest to us.